Dr. Jack Byron! Yay! Thank you, and I apologize for that. It's not going to happen again.
And I apologize too. But thank you very much for coming. And believe me, it is a real pleasure to be here and talk about Roatan. And I'm actually going to throw in a little bit about Cozumel right at the very end, because I think there's kind of a new opportunity on Cozumel that if you have a chance, please visit. As Alejandro said, my name is Jack Thomas. I've been all kinds of different things. I've been a petroleum geologist looking for oil and gas, and I actually found it. Found some oil and gas. It came in little quart cans. But besides that, I have worked, probably about 50 years now in the oil industry. I've been a college professor with my wife, 45 years my wife, and I. It's perfecto. In 45 years, we've actually gotten to the point where we always try to do something together, and one of the things we do together is we love to do Argentine tango. And this is something we were trying to get Alejandro to give us some extra lessons, and he said, imposible? For the Argentine tango lessons. No, impossible. Okay, but anyhow, let's go ahead and if you have any questions, what I'm going to try and do at the end is I'll repeat the question so that maybe somebody in the back who's snoring too loudly doesn't hear the question, and I can just restate it. But as I say, we're going to go through and we're going to talk about Roatan, and this is part of the Beyond the Podium Enrichment Series. So, Roatan really, in its history, has been a pirate's lair. It's been a diver's delight. Most of you know about the incredible scuba and snorkeling opportunities around Roatan, but we're going to say a little bit more about it. And as we go through here, I think you're going to find that there's some really unusual points about Roatan. I need some help. How many of you have been to Roatan already? 2, 4, 5, 6. Okay. If I fall ill during this lecture, will you please come up and... Okay, this is not a lecture. We're just a group of friends having a good time. Okay, so here we are. Roatan many times is called paradise. At 200 miles in altitude, looking at one of the satellite images, what you see for Roatan is its location, and we are almost due southeast of Cozumel, Mexico. And yet, everything is different from Cozumel all the way down the coast and over to Roatan. This is the area that has the second largest reef in the world, the second largest barrier reef in the world, and the Bay Islands, Roatan, Utala, and Guanaja, represent the 3 most southerly islands of the reef tract, okay? And this reef tract is several hundred miles long, and probably the most famous area besides Roatan is what's called Ambergris Key up in Belize, if you remember that. Roatan has a lot of small towns or villages or communities which surprisingly are not connected by paved roads. When you go to the island and you go to the west side, what's called the west end of the island, you'll find that they don't even want to pave the road. So you go riding up and down in a bus and you're saying, oh, this is terrible. No, it's wonderful. It really is. It's enjoyable. And we'll say more about the archaeology and the snorkeling and the diving as time goes on. Okay, so this is now an island that is part of the Honduran Republic. And the Honduran flag has something pretty significant to it. When we pull into port tomorrow, you're going to see this. The stars represent each of the different nations of the former Federal Republic of Central America. In other words, do you remember the term Banana Republic? Yeah. Okay, this was the Banana Republic. These nations got together and they wanted to have an economic bargaining unit. And so that's what they did, was to form this republic. El Salvador, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua. Now, the blue stripes represent the Caribbean and the Pacific Oceans, or the seas, and the white stripe represents the land in between. Now, figure this out. Roatan is only about 30 miles long, and in some places it's about 2 miles wide. Sometimes it's wider than that. So that's a pretty small stripe, at least what we're looking at. And we could say that Roatan is anywhere from 35 to about 50 miles offshore. So it is really kind of isolated. And how many of you remember when you had already booked your cruise, remember seeing something about Hurricane Richard? Do you remember that? And you're saying, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Is it going to be blown away? Are we going to have to go to a different island? What's going to go on? Well, we'll talk about that. And it's only 50 miles offshore, so it's a lot of interesting stuff in a very small area. It thrives on tourism and fishing. The sport fishing is just tremendous. There are about 30,000 people who call Roatan home, and every year there are between 250 and 300,000 people who visit the island. They don't all come by cruise ship. Some come by commercial air, but a lot of them come separately, actually taking a ferry across from the mainland. There are the 3 main islands. These are called the Bahia Islands, and perhaps, I'm a geologist, you know that. Perhaps the most important thing to me is to recognize that all 3 of these islands are actually the tips of volcanoes that popped up along the edge of one of these plates of the ocean floor, and it was because these volcanic islands popped up that you began to build coral reefs around them. So these islands actually grow because they're cored with volcanic rock, and then the fringe is all this reef material. The official language is Spanish, although there are a lot of what are called Amerindian dialects, primarily Mayan dialects or subdialects, but there is some English spoken, and actually you'll hear a lot of patois. And the reason you hear a lot of the patois is because in the history of the island, there were a number of people who were actually brought by the British government from Barbados, for example, to the island, and they represent the, if you will, the African or West African cultures that had been transplanted to the Caribbean. And so you hear a patois, which is really a tie-in of all the African languages plus the Arawak languages, native languages of the Southern Caribbean, and then the corruption with the Mayan. The currency right now is about 18.9 lempira to $1. Okay? And most of the time when you go on shore, you will be able to get prices that are quoted both ways. But the lempira is the official coinage. And then the ship docks at Cox and Hole. And Cox and Hole, and how many of you have been to Cox and Hole before? Oh, 1, 2. Hello back there. Any? No. All right. Cox and Hole is the largest community on the island. And you're going to say, my gosh, this is really small. But this island has little communities all over it that are fascinating. Okay, so it begins at Cox and Hole. If you were to look at Cox and Hole today, what you see is the new cruise terminal. And there are a lot of shops in there. And one of the things that my wife reminded me of was that you can actually get, I don't know about men, but ladies can get pedicures. And these pedicures are very reasonably priced. Sometimes $5, sometimes $10. And you still end up with all your toes. Now, that can be done right here. Sometimes there is an Independence Day, and what you will see is the students dressed up in their uniforms actually walking in a parade. And this is like small town America. So this is a very, very important time when you go through this Independence Day. Here is one of the little villages on the north side of the island. That's really small. There are probably no more than 50 homes in there, probably somewhere between 75 and 150 people living in those homes. But compare that to the resort areas. And the resort areas are around each one of these little pocket bays. And these bays are just beautiful. This little yellow trapezoid that I have in here, you could have that, a third of an acre, you could have that for less than $100,000 US if you wanted to buy it today. This is one of the properties that's for sale. And no, I'm not a realtor. Okay, so what can people do in this 70 square mile areas? First of all, you can do the 3 S's, or what I call the 3 S's. Sailing, scuba, snorkeling. You can do this to your heart's content. You can also do snuba. I suppose I could have put snuba in there too. Beach time, of course, is really important. But one of the things you have to watch out for are the sand fleas. The sand fleas are present around here primarily because we don't have any mosquito control. So what you do is you actually have bug repellent that you take with you, and you can cut down on the sand flea irritations that way. These are the no-see-ums, or the sand fleas that kind of leave a lasting impression on you, like a bunch of little red dots. But it's not everywhere. In the resort areas, you don't have nearly the same problem. You can shop at Pierside, we already talked about that, and you can visit the ecological parks. Now, one of the things about the ecological parks is that there has been a movement for probably the past 7 or 8 years now to establish ecological areas on the island. And I'll show you some pictures of a couple of them. But these are beautiful areas where you can see the native vegetation, the native life. And imagine, this is the vegetation which actually has been transported offshore, probably floating on water and everything else, or in the air, to be established. Okay, so now you're going to go into Coxon Hole, and you're going to be looking at the native crafts. And these are some really interesting things to do. First of all, there are gift shops. Now, I said right at the port, there are these stores in the 2 terminal buildings that you can look at, or there are the little kiosks on the outside. But if you walk through the fence and you go over to the little shops along the main street, what you do is you kind of walk into one of these little buildings, and you will see, where you saw one shop at the pier, you will see 20 or 30 shops, and they're all very small shops. They might look like this, and you will see a variety of things from conch shells all the way to mahogany doors that you can put in your luggage and carry home. What? You don't want to pay excess baggage to fly home with a mahogany door? No, anyhow, you can do that. All right, another thing you can do is you can go into some of these shops where, for example, do you see this? These 2 pots up here that are kind of a combination of dark and light colors with sort of a native pattern to it. Okay, that is pottery from the Lenca Nation. And the Lenca Indians actually are mainland Indians, but there are some small colonies on the island itself. And what's unique about this is that these people have actually come up with a resurgence of the old techniques that they had for decorating and making pots. And what's even more interesting is that it's the women who run the business. And so the women are the ones who insist on the patterns. The women are the ones who will supply the pots to the different shop holders on the island, and you can get some really unusual pots. We got one, it's probably about 12 inches in diameter, and it cost us, I think it was around $40. And it's very reasonable, especially when you try to see the Lenca pottery in the United States, and you see that it's about 3 times the price. A little bowl like that, or a little ashtray, will cost you somewhere between $3 and $5, okay, or 54 lempira. Another thing that you're going to see are the street vendors walking up and down the street, and they'll be selling lychee nuts. And you can eat these lychee nuts. They have a delicious taste. But here's another thing. I don't know how many of you are going to take a tour, but this is one of the most unusual places. I don't know of another island anywhere in the Caribbean where there is actually a cameo factory. And what you find is you walk into the Stone Castle, as it's called, which is down on the south coast, and the Stone Castle is actually where the local people are being trained, young people are being trained to carve these cameos. And so you might see a conch shell that's about that big, you know, like a dinner plate, and somebody will have an exquisite pattern that has been carved into that. It's very delicate. And the prices are I think they're quite reasonable. But what do I know? My wife is better at it than I am. Okay, so let's talk about the magic of Roatan. First of all, I mentioned the West End. If we look at the West End, this is all the West End right here. This is a little shop area. This is one of those dirt roads. Here's another dirt road right here, and you can literally walk to the beach, or you can walk out to one of these pierside bars, and you can look into the water, and you think the water is really shallow because you can see all the way down to the bottom. You can see the little coral heads growing at the base of the pier, and in fact, it's about 15 feet deep. And the reason it's so clear is that there's no kind of sediment that is being brought in from the land. Remember, we're between 35 and 50 miles offshore. You can do reef fishing. This is a picture that I took off of one of these piers, and this is, do you see that color change right there? That color change is where you go to the edge of the reef, and it drops to about 70 feet right there. And yet it looks like he is literally in 3 or 4 feet of water with this light blue, okay? And here is the main street on the West End. Obviously, traffic's not too heavy. The police officers out there give rides to people. You don't have to drink, but they will give you a ride on their motorcycle. I've got a picture of my wife before they incarcerated her. But no, I'm just kidding. But anyhow, they're very, very nice people to work with. And the drinks that are available there are alcoholic and non-alcoholic and very flavorful. But anyhow, this is the beginning of the relaxation, if you will, that you can experience on Roatan. These are the typical types of coral that you're going to find. These are colonial corals, which are photographed. These things are both taken at a depth of about 70 feet. And I did not take either one of these pictures, but both of these corals are very typical. This is a healthy coral growing environment, whereas in some places along the Florida Keys, you know that it's been a little difficult to maintain coral growth. Now, as you go from the West End and you start curling back along the south side of the island, and I'll show you a map here in a little bit, you're going to come to a community that's called Flowers Bay. And this is the oldest chapel on the island. Now, again, remember what I said about Hurricane Richard? Hurricane Richard brushed the island. That's all it did, was brush the island. The damage was not too much. It was the only damage that was reported in the newspaper was at the east end of the island. Flowers Bay is, well, I'll show you. Here is the house right next to the chapel at Flowers Bay. Flowers Bay got its name from a group of British adventurers who came from what was called British Honduras, or Belize. They came down to the island. They were supposed to establish a colony, and they would bring flowers out on cargo ships from the bay. Hence it was called Flower Bay, or Flowers Bay. And this is where the caretaker lives today. Here's his family, and this is the Caribbean right here. So when Hurricane Richard came through, you can imagine that the surge actually came up and kind of cleaned the floor in the cabin and probably did the same thing in the chapel. But to be able to go into the chapel and see how they hold their services on Sunday or how they hold their prayer sings on Wednesday is really kind of neat. It was the first British island settlement, and to say the least, life is relaxed there. You live outside of your building. You really do. And when we were there, the children were having a good time playing with sticks and shells. And that's all they were doing. They didn't have Nintendo or anything else like that. They had a great time with it. And they worked on their imagination. Okay, so Roatan, therefore, has been shaped by different kinds of forces. So we've got natural forces, we've got residential and commercial forces, and we've got cultural forces. And each one of these things has left some kind of an impression on the island. Hurricane Mitch, Hurricane Richard. Hurricane Mitch, I don't know if any of you remember Hurricane Mitch. I've got some stuff here I'll show you in a second about Mitch, but that was a destructive hurricane. Richard, nothing. We've got the fringing reef growth that we already talked about. Remember, growing around the edge of the island and therefore expanding the volcanic core. We've got the mountain building episode where we have the plates of the Caribbean sea floor moving back and forth and volcanoes actually popping up along those fault zones. Then we've got the residential and commercial forces. You saw the real estate. We'll say a little bit more about that in a second. And then the cultural forces. The Garifuna are the people who live primarily in little villages on the north side of the island. The access to them is either by a dirt road, or in some cases, these little villages or these little communities can only be reached by boat. Okay? Then you've got the people who came from the mainland, who are largely the Mayans, or Mayan descendants, who still speak a Mayan dialect, by the way, and they come in, but they actually interact with the Spaniards who came in here. The Spanish actually established colonies here from time to time, and the British, who also established a colony here, and believe it or not, North America and New Zealand. Again, we'll say some more. The piracy and the colonization, we'll say even more. Anybody ever heard of a pirate named Jack Sparrow? Okay, does he have another name? Who is the actor? Johnny Depp. Right, okay. Johnny Depp's character is actually modeled partly after one of the pirates who once inhabited this island. Okay? And we'll say some more about that. But with the colonization of this island, it went through British hands, it went through Spanish hands. The French actually were here for a very short period of time. The Dutch were here for a very short period of time. And now Australians and New Zealanders come here. They're not pirates, but they are actually having a pronounced influence on the island. And so what you find is that the people, for example, there is somebody with the surname Solomon who lives on the island, and he's a very dark-complected person. He's a pastor at one of the chapels, and he actually is a descendant of a British Honduran person who came to colonize the island back in the 18th century. And he speaks a type of English that is almost like an Old English when he speaks, if he allows himself to speak that way. There are little clusters of people who speak that way. There are little clusters of people who look like they are Mayan who speak only Spanish. They don't speak Mayan. So, here we go. We're going to talk about the major natural forces.